Yeah, sorry. Like last year, we did so many of these online talks, and 1 year passed, and all the knowledges are gone how to do it. All right. So I think we are online finally, and I'm very excited and honored to introduce Federico Campagna talk Home. That is a part of Rupert's public program uh, that explores themes of magic and rituals. Today's talk is a special one, and I will talk a bit in a moment. But first, I would like to introduce Federico Campagna, who is an Italian philosopher based in London. His latest books are Prophetic Culture and Technique and Magic, both published by Bloomsbury. He works as a philosophy lecturer at KABK, The Hague, and is a part of the publishing house Verso Books. Also, he is the host of philosophy podcast over Morse Library. And Federico develops a long-term collaboration with Franco Bifo Berardi, and the podcast that they are doing via Knit Together is a highly recommended one. Seeing differences and similarities between desires, how a different world and choosing different paths towards that world. For me, one's most inspiring is Federico's ability to seamlessly and gracefully move between different time periods, fields, and worlds. From poetry of Ibn Arabi in his book Technique and Magic, to video game design in his doctoral thesis Metaphysics and Metaesthetics in the Design of Strategy video games, and to prophetic cultures in his later books, in his latest book. And I have to admit that Federico's book Technique and Magic was a major inspiration for the theme that Rupert is working this year. And despite firmly identifying himself as philosopher, who, and I quote from one of our conversations on the Louise and Wright's book, Federico had an immense impact on many artists, curators, and thinkers. Last year, we've been receiving many applications for our residency program that included and referred his works as inspiration for their artistic practices. And as you might know, the talk will be followed by a short conversation between Federico and Mónica Mays, whose exhibition Bucolic Gang opens tomorrow at 6 p.m. in Vilnius. And the conversation and the connection between the talk and the exhibition is not an accidental one. Mónica last year began her residency just when pandemic hit and everybody left. So for a couple of months in solitude, Mónica stayed at Rupert's building and among other things, reading Federico's book, Technique and Magic. And when the borders opened and the situation allowed traveling, we invited Mónica back to continue her research as a commission for public program and production residency that resulted in the exhibition. And by the time we were already inviting Federico for a public talk, and the idea was to see if there's a deeper and more direct connection between ideas and works, and seeing how this connection can be developed. Mónica liked the idea, wrote a letter to Federico explaining her practice and all the overlaps between her practice and his thought. That was followed by a few online meetings, and the result is today's talk. So today you're gonna hear Federico's talk, followed by the short conversation between Mónica and Federico. And if we have time, you can also ask questions on YouTube or Instagram, depending which platform you're using. So thank you very much, Federico and Mónica, and the screen is yours.
Yeah, thank you. Sorry, I couldn't unmute myself. Hello, and thank you Thank you so much for having me. It's a pleasure to be at Rupert, and it's an honor to speak as part of Mónica Mays' exhibition. So I would like to speak relating to Monica's work, and in particular to some aspects of her work, in part as you will see in the exhibition, and in part also as you can see in the rest of her production. Excuse me a second. So something that struck me in Monica's work, and I'm not, of course, an art historian, I'm not an art critic, and so I cannot speak with that kind of level of confidence, but is the interrelatedness of three elements: ecology, domesticity, and tradition. And so I would like to look at the way in which these three relate with each other. Ecology and domesticity relate with each other very simply. You see already it is in the word ecology, like economy or ecosystem. There is the Greek word oikos in the Erasmian pronunciation, which means home. So the ecology has to do with the logos of the home, something to do with the, sorry, excuse me a second. Something to do with the ordering of that big house, which is the world. Domesticity, of course, has to do with the home in the sense of building, the building of the home. And so the two have to do with each other because they deal with the same thing, the home, in a macro scale and in a micro scale. And the fact that they deal with each other together with this combination of macro and micro is typical of the traditional way of looking at making artifacts and making art. Traditional craft. Traditional craft has this typical ability of keeping together the dimensions of the micro and of the macro, but also as other elements. And we look at them now in a moment in this short talk dedicated to the home, which I hope will lead to a conversation with Mónica later. Traditional craft, I say, what is a traditional craft? Tradition is a word that is sometimes abused. Traditional societies are societies that are typically pre-modern, but pre-modern not only in the sense that they don't have the technical skills, but more clearly in the sense that a traditional society is a society that is not yet fully secularized. So that doesn't have yet a complete distinction between the sacred and the secular. It does have that distinction, but not to such an extent that, as it happens in our society, the world around us is entirely secular, and then the sacred is somewhere hidden in the corners of some superstition. So a traditional society is a place where the sacred and the secular are merged with each other. Traditional societies also are typically less technologically advanced, at least in terms of the historical records that we have of them. And so, because of that detail, they tend to be societies that don't have enough resources to waste on useless frills. Traditional societies tend to create artifacts and to look at construction and production in a way that is essential. They need to have things that function, that work. They cannot have useless stuff. And so whatever they create in a traditional way, and traditional societies, of course, you can be found anywhere in the world. Nowadays, not so much, but in the past, of course. So whenever they build something, whenever they create, they engage with something, they engage with an idea of supreme functionality. Everything has to be very functional. Very strange if we think about it, because we think today that we are being very functional in our productions. And traditional societies had a lot of strange bits, for example, ornaments, or some superstitious things about arranging the home in a certain way, things that don't really serve any function. Anthropologists usually try some way to find some other material function to these things, and sometimes they cannot find them. The key here to understand this is that the notion of functionality depends on the notion of utility. So something is functional on the basis of what you think is useful. Something is functional to achieve that goal. And the notion of utility, what is useful, depends on the notion that you have of what is the point of being in the world, how the world is arranged and created, and how reality is fundamentally structured. This happens, for example, in a game. In a game, a certain movement, for example, on a chessboard, it makes sense and it is functional to the game because you know how the game is structured, you know what are the finalities of the game, and so on and so forth. Metaphorically in the game, but practically in reality, then a society has a certain idea of what is functional and useful, depending on the idea they have of reality around themselves. So traditional artifacts are very useful in two ways, and that reveals already a bit their notion of reality, which you can already find, I think, in many ways in the work of Mónica Mays. Traditional artifacts serve a double function. Let's imagine, for example, a decorated knife. A decorated knife has the first function of cutting the meat, cutting wood, so the typical function of the object. But then has a second function. It functions as a cognitive enhancer, which means when you use the knife, not only you're cutting, but you're also somehow expanding your understanding of what reality fundamentally is, both in the terms of what is visible and in the terms of what is invisible. The same happens to yourself, of course, expanding your understanding of yourself in the visible and in the invisible realms. These two functions, the immediate functionality of the object and the functionality as a cognitive enhancer, as an expander of the mind, so to say, they are never separate in traditional artifacts. The Indian historian of art and philosopher and many other things, Ananda Kentish Komaraswamy, for example, observed that in traditional artifacts, you never have a separation between pure function, pure concept, and pure ornament. But the three are always together because they need to act together on this double usefulness register. How can they act together in a double usefulness register? Well, that depends on their idea of reality. Traditional reality, in the many different instantiations that it has had in history, is typically multi-layered and multi-dimensional. The idea is that the world that we see around ourselves contains within itself many layers of world, so many worlds, many dimensions that are existing together, although they're not immediately visible to each other, even though they don't immediately share the same temporality, but that somehow they are in the same thing. And the challenge, of course, is to negotiate the junctures between these different worlds. For example, the shaman is typically the person that negotiates the movement of spirits, of souls, of bodies, in and out of the different dimensions that compose reality. So this room, for example, in traditional understanding, metaphysical understanding, is not only reducible to what we can catalog with language, to the books that we can see behind into the images immediately, but there's got a lot more to that. And this lot more belongs to different dimensions. So tools, artifacts in this particular understanding have to be useful and have to be operative and functional simultaneously on all the different dimensions of reality. For this reason, a knife is not enough if it simply cuts, because while it cuts in the dimension of reality in which the point is to cut the meat, it has to also serve other functions in reference to the other dimensions of reality. For example, it has to serve a function in the present where you're cutting. It has to serve a function in reference to the dimensions that are above the immediate reality that you see around yourself, that are below, and that are lateral to it. Let's give the example, moving towards the idea of home, of a house building. House building has the present immediate function of being a shelter, a dwelling. Then it relates with the lateral dimension. The first one is being yourself, the lateral one being the others, of hospitality. But then it is also the place where the Chthonian forces, so the forces of the earth, the underworld to a certain extent, can come out, but also can be kept down. So it is a kind of like opening and closing gate with the underworld. And towards the top, towards the heavenly spheres, so to say, it is also a passageway that allows movement once again. We'll see this in a moment in more detail. So traditional artifacts have the function, the first function of doing what they are supposed to do, but they have a second function of allowing the user to be operative and to move across these different dimensions of reality. We find this particularly in traditional buildings, and we are moving towards the home. First of all, in traditional cities. The typical traditional plan for a city, I think, for example, of the sacred city of the emperors in China, but also of many cities like Baghdad in the 9th century being built by Harun al-Rashid, or by traditional cities built in the Mesopotamian period, and so on and so forth. So their particular structure typically is a figure of the entirety of the world contained into one urbanistic plan. They often have the shape of a square or of a circle, depending on various metaphysical metaphors, traversed by 4 lines, like a Roman encampment, which are the typical 4 streams that traverse the earthly paradise, because the earthly paradise is the image of the world. So the earthly paradise already contains the image of the entirety of the universe. And the city is an image of the earthly paradise. So by inhabiting that city, you are creating a city, but at the same time, you are providing a cognitive enhancer to the people that live in it and the people that approach it. It allows them to be reminded about the invisible structure of the entirety of the universe. But more interesting in terms of buildings that can do that, that can serve as cognitive enhancers, we find the temples. Temples, we will see, are the real model of the home, fundamentally. Why? Well, let's see what a temple is. A temple is a space that is, first of all, cut off from the rest. There is the sacred space, and there is the profane space, and there is the sacred space. The temple issues a separation. As I was saying, traditional societies understand the two as mashed together. But then there is a specific place, which is the temple, where the sacred can be approached in its pure form, so to say. So this delimitation of that particular place of emanation, where the sacred emerges, where the invisible is somehow at home, is the temple. This cutting comes from the word temnein in Greek, from which also the term temple. Temple has an element of that word, temnein, to cut. But temple also contains another word within itself. And this word has to do with the second function of the temple, the second element, which is that the temple is the place where you can see differently. You can have acquire a different vision of reality. And here we find the word templum. In ancient Rome, the word templum was used to mean a particular space which was delimited by the staff of the Etruscan diviners. You know, the Etruscans were very famous in Rome as fortune tellers. They could interpret the flight of birds or the entrails of animals. And they would do it, the interpretation of the flight of birds, through this staff, which has this shape, which you will see remains in Christianity as the typical episcopal staff of the bishop. They would raise the staff and look through that particular section here, called the templum. And through the templum, they would contemplate, which is where the word comes from, the flight of the birds across it. And then they would be able to interpret the meaning of their flight. So a temple, as a templum, is also a place in which you acquire a different type of vision. But a temple is also another specific place where it has to do with the different dimensions of reality. A temple is, and here René Guénon is particularly interesting in his interpretation of this, is the place that is traversed by the axis mundi. What does this mean? Axis mundi means let's say, the beam of the world, the pillar of the world, the sacred tree that holds up the world in Germanic mythologies, for example. So the notion here, of course, symbolically, is that the world is traversed by a pillar that holds up the entire edifice of the universe, but also that connects the different layers and the different levels of the world. It comes from the very bottom, and then it goes through the visible world into the invisible world above. The axis mundi is very important because it's that vertical cutting on the horizontality of the world, and you see the symbol that it creates. You know, when you have the horizontality of the visible world and the axis mundi cutting across it, it creates a symbol of a cross, of course, which is also, and that verticality is the passageway that the shaman, the mystic, the angels on Jacob's ladder, and so on and so forth, have to walk up to go up and find again a vision of that invisible realm that maybe at some point was visible, but that has become invisible now. Maybe at some point the gods were among us, some people say, and then they left. And now the shaman, for example, in Siberian mythology, has to go up this tree, to go up and see them again, reestablish a communication. What is interesting, of course, is that if the temple is the place where the horizontal plane of reality is traversed by the vertical, then being the point of conjuncture, is in a very special place. The very special place is a space and is also a special time, is what the Christians call the kairos, the now time, the moment in which time and eternity break into each other. It is a very special place because that place is the pivotal axis of the entire world. So the world spins, of course it revolves, but it revolves around a center. This center is what is usually known as the world mountain. The world revolves on a mountain, and the temple is typically built on top of a mountain or represents a mountain, Angkor Wat, for example, or symbolically as an element of this mountain in which over which the world revolves as around the center. And indeed, the temple is the center of the world. What does it mean to be the center of the world? To be the center of the world means that it is the place from which the world emanates. Imagine that the world, the reality as we perceive it in all its many dimensions, is like a flow of water. The temple is the hose, is like the spring from which the world emerges. And here there is a problem. The problem is that, for example, in ancient Greece, there was the idea that the center of the world was the omphalos in Delphi. In Delphi, there was the omphalos, this particular oval stone, which was supposed to be the navel of the world. Very good. Okay, so that was the place from which the world has emerged. But there was more than one omphalos in Greece. And not only that, if any temple is the center of the world, how many centers of the world are there? Now, the answer, of course, is there are infinite centers of the world. Indeed, potentially every single place is a center of the world. Depends how you look at it. And the function of the temple is to allow you to recognize in that particular space a sacred space, so a center of the world. This paradox that there are many centers of the world according to a traditional mentality is best exemplified by the example of the home. The home building functions on these multiple layers as well. And the home building has certain characteristics that are typical also of the temple. The first of which, it is a center of the world. It is that place, that here is the home, is that here, which which then rhetorically, so to say, becomes the oikos of which the ecosystem is another example. But it is also architecturally not only the here for me, home is home, the heart, but also it is the place where the axis mundi passes again. You find this in traditional architecture. For example, you find it in the construction of yurts, which are usually round or sometimes square, sometimes, but usually they are round, with a hole at the top of the tent where the smoke comes up. The heart or the stove is in the middle, and from the fire and the embers down there, the fire comes up, the smoke comes up and passes through the hole at the top of the ceiling, where it connects back to the skies, very similarly to how in Christian, especially Orthodox churches, the smoke of incense goes up to the sky like prayers. You find this same structure in Mycenaean archaeology, Mycenaean architecture, as we know archaeologically, in the structure of the main room in the house, in the palace, the megaron. In the megaron, you would have the heart, the fire, not on the sides, like in a Victorian house, like this one, for example, but in the center of the room, in a circular shape, and then in a square shape, and then with an opening at the top that would reopen the gates to the worlds above, so to say. So the home replicates that space which represents the entirety of the world. That is a center of the world of which multiple instantiations there are, and that is a particular place that has a double function. It is a locality where you can take shelter, have a domestic life, but also is that place where you can be constantly reminded about the interrelations between the different dimensions of reality and your place within them. So what I find interesting in the combination of these suggestions, of these influences in the work of Mónica Mays, which, as I said, which I don't analyze as an art historian or as an art critic or curator, which I'm not, or an artist, I'm not, but philosophically, is this familiarity with the notion of domesticity and home in traditional artifacts and with a traditional outlook on craft and production, which is also revealing of a traditional outlook on reality itself. And I think these elements can teach us a few interesting elements. And I will conclude on this point, and then I look forward to discussing more with Mónica and to respond to any questions that there might be. The first thing that they reveal, these works that we find, these traditional works about the home, so to say, or related to it, is a broader understanding of reality. A reality as a multi-layered field, which is in the constant necessity of having bridges across the different dimensions. In traditional works, you always have this slight anxiety about controlling the passageways between the dimensions. With the dead, sometimes you want to keep them out. For example, you have to be careful and keep them out. With the heavens, you want to reopen the gate and the passage. And the point is always working on the infrastructures between the different dimensions of reality. We can understand this also in a much more modest way in our contemporary parlance, with the attempt to bridge the gaps between different forms of worlds, different ideas about reality, both among the humans and among the humans and the so-called non-humans. So this sensitivity to the bridging of the distance between worlds is typical and can be found in traditional works about the home. But also it speaks to us about the artificiality of reality. Because if you think that the world emerges from a center like water out of a spring, it means that it's fluid. And also it means that it wasn't always there in that particular form. Water is always different, like Heraclitus used to point out. You never encounter the same water twice, the same flowing water twice. And so what we might be mistakenly inclined to believe is the fixed nature of nature. So nature has this Aristotelian kind of cut, divided, clear division between things which are immutably like that, where this is this and this is that. And that's it, whether you like it or not. And if we have a disagreement about something in reality, it means that one of us is wrong fundamentally, or both of us, because that thing is defined and forever. Then in a traditional understanding, you see that nature is always artificial. It's always a production, always an emergence, a creation, an overflowing, which has liquid qualities to it. But it also tells us that this element tells us that the control of the centers of the world is of supreme importance. Why? Because the center of the world is the place from out of which reality originates and springs out. And that means that who controls the centers of the world is capable of controlling the emergence of reality itself. And who doesn't, in some way, control those centers of the world, or at least own one for themselves, have a home in that sense, have that nurture within themselves, or physically a passageway, these people would be trapped within the dream of reality of others. So this means also a reminder of the importance to fight for the means of production of the world, which means controlling or reclaiming that fundamental imagination that is capable of keeping together, as Ananda Kentish Komaraswamy was saying about traditional artifacts, of keeping together in everything that we do, the function, the concept, and the ornament, keeping them together. So allowing this bridging of the different layers. And it's interesting because if we say that the point here is controlling the center of the world, or one of the infinite centers of the world, to keep together also in our work, these different functions and these different layers, what comes to mind is the fact that the one that tries to separate function, concept, and ornament, the one that tries to break the bridges between the different layers of reality, in the same way that, for example, in our contemporary society, we try to separate often function, concept, and ornament, most typically in capitalist societies. That's usually to sell them separately, or to understand reality as entirely closed in boxes, or in only one box without an outside, a monodimensional box. Well, the one that divides is in Greek the one that does diaballein. Diaballein, devil. The devilish work is the work of the separator. And traditional artifacts have this ability to be anti-diabolical in this beautiful sense. And finally, I think what is interesting to discover in this particular sensibility that has to do with this movement between ecology, domesticity, and tradition, has to do also with the interrelatedness of all the oikoi. Oikos is, as I was saying once again in the Erasmian pronunciation, is the Greek word for home, from which eco. And the many ecos that there are all together interrelated. Each of them is a passageway to move between the dimensions of reality, to move beyond the dimensions of reality that are immediately visible and into the invisible. And all together in this infinity of centers of the world, they reveal a picture in which there is an invisible heart to reality with infinite visible manifestations. And the challenge here, as with the construction of a house, which is as big as the world, as the construction of a city that is in the same shape of the world, or the thought, as for example, in the corpus hermeticum, of a mystical thought that is capable of containing everything. The challenge, silent but issued within traditional works, is to create a relationship of profound solidarity between all the different oikoi that you find. Because ultimately the challenge is to see them all together in their irreducible diversity and in their coincidence of opposites. But I look forward now, as I was saying, I will close now because I look forward to talking with Mónica about her work and also possibly to respond to any questions or comments you might have.
Thank you very much, Federico. It was very interesting, and I really enjoyed that means of production includes the imagination as well. I think that's a great addition to the classic formulation. And also, I think it's very symbolic that Mónica's exhibition is happening in a former church that was abandoned for many years and was reintroduced. But during the Soviet time, the church was turned into a warehouse, and additional floors were introduced, so cutting the building in half. So now you have like this building that functions in part as a church, as a gallery space, and also as a kind of a restaurant. So I'll ask a few questions for both of you, but feel free to also respond to each other and comment your own, your colleagues' answers. So my first question was about the narration of the world. Like, who is the person that is able to narrate these multiple meanings of, say, the home or the temple? Can we easily identify this figure and what kind of qualities it has to possess? I think it's for, yeah, it's for you, both of you, but I think it's more for you, Federico.
Okay. Yeah, sure. Well, I think as you implicitly said, it is more than a figure; it's a function. So that is the function of the one that is capable of doing this. Sometimes this function is specified in particular figures. The shaman, for example, is one, but also you would have other figures like the singer. The singer is another person that has this particular function in traditional worlds. I think that it's more useful to consider it more as a function than as a particular person, because there is, if we consider as a particular person, we might run the risk of doing that kind of automatic division of labor, which is our typical modern way of understanding relating with activities. If we see it more as a function, we understand it more as a register, in the sense that in whatever we do, if we do it in that particular register that tackles that particular function, then we are capable of acting in that way, shamanically or poetically. So I wouldn't locate it in one particular person. I would just keep it more open as a function, as a register of doing.
Yeah, so thank you. And for you, Mónica, maybe you could bounce off some of the ideas about the supreme functionality and the function, let's say, within the Baroque that you explore in your practice.
Yeah.
And you also talk about multiple Baroques and different ways of both using the term and also experiencing the different iterations of it, be it architecture, art, or writing.
Yeah. Well, to answer a bit the first question you were asking, Federico, and to introduce myself a bit to the audience who might not be familiar with my practice, I'm interested in telling stories, be them true or not through an anthropomorphic witness, but through materials, artifacts, and ornaments themselves. And of course, there's an impossibility of me to be able to translate these agents through my own voice, but then I kind of incorporate them into a series of sculptures. And as Tautvidas was saying, the exhibition that I'll be presenting tomorrow does happen in a church, and it happens in a Baroque church. This is not coincidental. I've been looking at the Baroque and the Neo-Baroque and new ways of conceptualizing them as a networked aesthetics of complexity. So on one hand, this speaks to me from its formal characteristics that are of excess, of ornateness, of the decentering proliferation, let's say, almost like the anti-minimalist principle of more is more, which kind of goes against that idea of utility that Federico was putting forward, or it does, as you explained well, in its multi-layering. And I find it very much a crossroads of signs and temporalities. This particular church has many histories in it. And I think Vilnius is known, I've heard it been called the Baroque Vilnius. It's one of the most further north European examples or cities containing Baroque architecture. And I really like, I'm very attracted to these botanical shapes that are present all over the space that is the temple. And they're both growing and decaying at the same time, right? They're like pushing up and trying to eradicate their borders. They're trying to somehow create a form of perspective or of movement. And I've been thinking through these lines, these ornaments, as a thought pattern, as a way of reading across temporalities. Of course, Western history insists in this being like a period, but in fact, it traverses many spaces and times, right? It's throughout 4 centuries, and it's even now spoken of as like a neo-Baroque. It's a contemporary movement, and yeah, curiously, on top of this church, where I'll exhibit tomorrow, that I'm right next to right now, there is a cross on top of it that has these axes that Federico was doing, like this and like this. But because I understood that Lithuania is one of the last places to, I'm going to allow myself to say, be colonized by Christianity. The way that these axes are represented on this particular church are not in straight angles. It actually incorporates the shape of a moon and of a sun, and it has different vegetations kind of growing out of it. And this was something that I found very evocative to me, no? Both being a Baroque from a specific 16th century, but then having incorporated a new architecture within its architecture, and then in its own symbolism, having incorporated other artifacts within itself as well. Yeah, I guess for me it's interesting because it's not so much about, I guess the movement for me is more like this than like this somehow, or it's more of like a contracting and expanding one, where it's like absorbing and expelling. Yeah, I guess I think that's a bit what I wanted to say to answer to your question.
Thank you. Federico. And is there like, what is the relation between the home and the temple in a sense of that purification? It seems that the temple kind of purifies the idea of what home holds, like these multiple centers, and why one should go to the temple instead of staying at home in order to experience the world that they created.
Well, one doesn't necessarily have to go to the temple, I think. This was an old dispute. There is a distinction between, how they called, between localized and, I think the description in terms of the history of religion is between localized and utopian religions. Localized religions are religions that are basically connected to particular specific places. So the Temple of Jerusalem, for example, is one, or particular locations, which are especially sacred. One, Mecca, one has to go to Mecca, to that particular place. And then there is a way of understanding the religious experience, which here, of course, doesn't mean what is usually associated today with the religious experience. Today, the religious experience is associated with lifestyle choices having to do with civil rights, like a bad way about civil rights and all the terrible things, but more generally understood as a metaphysical openness. They are defined as utopian, but not in the sense of being about some afterlife in the future or something like some progress towards a better future, but utopian in the etymological sense of being utopos, so we're not localized in a particular place. And the debate between these two attitudes can be found within religions as well. A typical example here of somebody that, like I say, would claim that there is no particular reason to go to a temple to purify oneself, but you can stay at home, was a 9th century Sufi mystic called Al-Hallaj. Al-Hallaj had a bad idea because of the political situation at the time where he was in the place where he was living, to say that it was not necessary to go to the Kaaba in Mecca to do a pilgrimage, but then you could, the Mecca was everywhere. You know, you can just like, the Kaaba is wherever you like, fundamentally. He had a bad idea because then he was executed for this. He also had a bad idea of keeping to say, I am God, okay, which is also another, dangerous thing to say in certain environments. And I share with Al-Hallaj this understanding that the difference between the temple and the home, apart from the functionality, apart from the immediate architectural aspects, it's very thin. It's very thin in the sense that, like, the templification of a home depends on the way in which it is understood as a plan. Now, it is interesting to see that this ability to see that the temple quality of a domestic dwelling seems to be largely absent in contemporary architecture and entirely absent in contemporary architecture dedicated to low-income people, to the lower classes. The way in which contemporary architects build homes for the lower classes as they think them, they are pens for animals, okay? They're not in any way related to a place that could somehow function not only as a shelter, which not even does that, but also as a cognitive enhancer. The real challenge, I think, here is to templify the home and to understand that when you build something like a home for anyone, and here is a challenge, especially to architects, you have to create something that functions on these multiple layers. You have to create something that holds together function, concept, and ornament, and has to function as a cognitive enhancer, and anything less than that will not do. Okay, so it's not that you can build a council home that is like a prison and then think like, oh, well, it's a home. What more do you want? Okay, so in that sense, there is no real distinction between them. It's a particular way of thinking the construction of the home and inhabiting the home. That said, there is a reason why you have also temples as specific buildings, and it's like it's not a bad idea to have them or to preserve them. And the reason is a cognitive, in terms of cognitive enhancement, but more in terms of remembering. Specific buildings function sometimes as memory machines, in the sense that you need sometimes a concentration that reminds you, that triggers a memory of something that you can find disseminated everywhere, but that without the constant reminder, sometimes you might lose, okay? It's like in a relationship, sometimes saying stuff like, I love you, it's irrelevant but relevant. Okay, it's like it's a trigger that somehow brings back all the memory of something that we both know, but it's important sometimes to like solidify in one moment, in one word, or in one particular building. As I was saying, what is especially unfortunate in contemporary architecture is that not only you have homes that are not templified in any form, but also you don't have any temples. So in that case, you not only don't have the actuality of constructions meant as cognitive enhancers, but also you don't have the possibility of thinking about them. And this is a real annihilation, I have to say.
Yeah, that's so interesting. Thank you. I was wondering, would you have any contemporary examples of, in order to think of a new home or a new temple that is not currently at use, or do you have an imaginary of these artifacts or ornaments? Or, I mean, I'm calling them artifacts and ornaments because that is what helps me. But perhaps you have like other specific examples of how to bring these into materiality. So be it an architecture, a type of architecture, or a practice. A practice could also be a method.
I'm not specifically an architect, so I don't have kind of like I'm not working on a particular architectural plan, so I don't have the scheme in mind in that sense. I find them sometimes at work in artistic situations, in artistic contexts, where you try to create a place as a situation. So like in the literally a situationist understanding of what a place fundamentally is, and that mixture of what they call sometimes the multisensorial experience. So that you understand that the entire space is a situation which is made of a conjunction of time, movement, architecture, multisensorialism. In that case, I see that you have the toolkits already to create something like that, all on the table available. What sometimes is missing is the imagination, in the sense of like, then you have that particular metaphysical horizon that it says, okay, I can use these things, not just to make a beautiful marketing stunt for the next film Dune, okay, or for the release of the next Nike trainers, but I could use this as not just a temporary setting, but as a permanent setting. This is the bit that it seems to me is lacking. But I observe most often, I have to say, popular architecture. So because of my own social standing, I don't have access to the houses of the multi-billionaires in California. Who knows? Maybe their homes are like that. I have no idea. But for the vast majority of the people that I see, this seems to be at the moment entirely absent. But one thing, sorry if I keep on, but you were mentioning the Baroque. Yeah. Which incidentally is a great love of mine, both visually and musically. But one thing that I find fascinating here about the Baroque is the abundance of ornaments in two ways. One has to do with the ornament within the building, and one has to do with the ornament outside of the building. And the first has an educational quality, the second has a political, social function, both of which seem to be missing at the moment. Within the church, for example, within a palace, the point of a building in that particular way is to communicate something fundamentally. It's a function and then wants to communicate something. A church communicates that particular openness to the divine. The palace communicates the power and the majesty. At the moment when we communicate the power and the majesty, we tend to build an enormous tower, a skyscraper, the Shard in London, something not particularly nice in any way, and inside really banal, but basically has one concept, power and might, in one image, massive spike. In churches, in Protestant churches, for example, you have a similar attitude. The concept is God, okay? The point is everything entirely blank, no distractions. You need to get to that immediately, clear message, a piece of information. Now, this is not the way in which that's the way in which people acquire information, but that's not the way in which people acquire knowledge. People acquire knowledge through a process. You don't have like point A, point B, the shortest line is a straight line. You need to go on a detour. So the point in a Baroque church, for example, in a Baroque palace, but in Baroque church in particular, is that to communicate the ineffability of God, then you accompany the viewer through a series of distractions. Look at this, look at that. The distraction is infinite. It's a series of movements all around that never seemingly seems to take you to that place, but like a labyrinth inevitably takes you to the middle. And the same also in palaces. The other bit is about the Baroque, which I find beautiful, is the attention to the facade, which I think has a progressive quality, politically progressive. If you think about it, the typical experience of a rich person is from the inside of the building looking out. The rich person is the one that has access to the building. The poor person is the one that is on the street and might move in and out of the whatever, just like doing their errands from the crappy little place to another crappy little place. And the only place that is available for all of the poor people is the public space. Creating facades that are ornate, that basically somehow ennoble the entirety of the public square, as it happens in Rome, in Seville, or in many other places. That as a function of furnishing in a homely way, in the high sense of home that we were saying, that public home, which is the street, which is the square, which is the typical street and the square of the poor, not of the rich. Now, in a society like such as, for example, that is displayed by the architecture of London, in which there are no facades, you have these brutalist outlines outside, everything is either flat or even worse, glass and steel, where you basically see inside the tower, but you don't have any facades of any kind. The street is entirely deserted. The poor don't deserve anything. And fundamentally, what you have in these glass and steel towers that we have today, the anti-Baroque par excellence, you don't have facades. You have lookouts. The people inside are looking out at the zoo of humanity underneath. And this is, in theory, it seems to be like a modernist, progressive, blah, blah, blah. In practice, it is incredibly regressive. The Baroque, of course, contained very regressive elements in the social order that it contained, but it also, I think, contained some very progressive cultural aspects, among which this one.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Yeah. Also, I find these kind of more sterile and flattened architectures trying to be extremely utilitarian, right? But in the one-dimensional layer of it that you were describing. So I guess the Baroque ceased to exist, or was dismissed, didn't cease to exist its existence today, traversing 4 centuries, but it as a period, it was considered apolitical and superficial. And I think that aspect of it is what also makes it a very interesting container. It doesn't have that just like very unilateral functionality that could be applied to it, but then it allows for other things to emerge. And another question that I wanted to ask you, coming back a bit to the potential new images. I know in your latest book, Prophetic Culture, you speak about the ruin often, and I like this. I was thinking about it. I allowed myself to compare this to the allegory being like the story within the story, and then kind of seeing the ruin as this, this piece of one thing simmering into another. And then you also mentioned how the temple might act as this memory machine, which is a very interesting element, right? So that memory machine made me think of the ruin in the sense of perhaps it's not the new temple, besides it being a situation, it could also be a container for something to remember. And I was wondering if you could maybe propose something or expand on that a little bit, since I find it very compelling.
Thank you, actually. Thank you for mentioning that. Yes, it's true. Like I've been writing about ruins for a bit, and the way in which I write about ruins has a lot of what you're saying. Of course, I imagine that listeners might not know, so I might give a little kind of summary. So the idea here is, of course, to understand ruins not only as something old, which they usually are, so the remnants of a certain age, of a past age, but to understand them as the remnants of past worlds. This has to do with a particular way of dividing history. We tend to divide history on the basis of economic and social and political structures. So we see the movements of history when the social and political structures change, which is one way. Another way of considering the movement and the shifting of the ages has to do with ideas about reality, fundamentally. So with metaphysics, when different worlds emerge, when people inhabit different hypotheses about how the world is fundamentally arranged, what stuff fundamentally there is, what are the relationships between the visible and the invisible, and so on and so forth. What you mean by identity? You have a place in which in the corpus hermeticum, you would have the idea that the human is fundamentally an androgynous. And you would have in 19th century Victorian England the idea that the human is fundamentally divided in genders. These two are not just cultural differences, they're metaphysical differences. So a ruin is something that comes from an old world in that metaphysical sense. But it's also something, it's not just anything. It's not just anything that speaks of a previous hypothesis, but it's something that speaks of a previous hypothesis while bringing something to the people living in the new world, something useful. Fundamentally, something useful to what they need to do, to create new worlds. They usually the ruins are most exploited at the very beginning of a new world, when people just scavenge through them looking for stuff to start new narrations, new ideas, new hypotheses about reality, new civilizations. And the people that scavenge through them, they are looking for something that might help them to create a different world, a new world. I think that in that situation, so the situation of the newcomers of a new world, like the people that will come after the end of our hypothesis about reality, as it is normal, our world will end. It will not be the end of the world, it will be the end of our world, and that's okay. It's not a big disaster. They will look at our legacy, looking for something useful, in the same way that they will look at our environmental legacy to see what's left to basically allow life to flourish again. We understand this very well in environmental terms. We shouldn't leave them something completely dead, or we should leave them something not even completely frozen, like a garden. We need to leave them something that keeps on mutating and becoming new.
So what would that be? What shape would that take?
Well, it's difficult to reply in a word, because my last book is an answer, it attempts to answer this question in particular. I discuss this as a form of prophetic culture. The idea is fundamentally that to speak to people coming at the beginning of a new world from an old and dying world, you need to understand their particular sensitivity and their particular subjectivity. We don't know what they will be like. Well, we know that they will be archaic. That's usually the name of the people at the beginning of a new world. And as archaics, they will have the typical subjectivity of an adolescent. An adolescent is also somebody that comes after the end of the world of childhood, at the beginning of the world of adulthood. And that sensitivity is looking for something, is looking for a way to create a world that is not too stiff, too rigid. Adolescents usually have a worry about that, become imprisoned within the structure of their world, or within their identity, but also that is not too loose, because if it becomes too loose, it is impossible to build anything on it. So something in the middle, so to say, something in between. Mm-hmm. And my suggestion in that book is that this way in between, this particular style in between, is what could be called the prophetic style, which has some characters of, I cannot go in detail now, of course, for reasons of time, and also because I would like to talk about your work more than about my own, but has to do with characters of grotesqueness, so combination of different registers about the different dimensions of reality, elements of silence, so the crossing of the cross, so to say, so the points of conjuncture, has to do with different understanding of the author as a place of contemplation rather than as a person that does stuff, of the audience as something that disappears. It's more than the death of the author is the death of the audience. And a few other things about memory palaces and the way of basically acting directly as a material on memory things, on memory machines. And with a particular sensitivity, I think, to the work that is fundamentally therapeutic. And here, maybe that's the last thing that I would like to say about this, is in the way in which we produce work in the perspective of leaving ruins, fertile ruins to those that will come. I think it's good to have a therapeutic attitude, but in the etymological sense of the word, because the theraps in Greek is the comrade, from which therapy. So the therapy is the relationship of comradeship. Your comrade is your therapist. So to have a relationship of solidarity with the people of the future is to act therapeutically towards them. Mm-hmm. We usually think of therapy as self-directed. Therapy is basically for me, okay? But now thinking of therapy hetero-directed, it doesn't mean necessarily to be selfless or altruistic, which doesn't actually mean anything, but to have a relationship of comradeship and solidarity with people from another world that you don't yet know who they are, and for whom you are the past. And this is the wonderful thing. A good kind of like point of perspective to act in this way is to remind yourself that in as much as you are the creator of ruins for a post-future, you are the past. And as the past, you have that particular flavor of the past, but also you are together with all the rest of the past. There's you, there's Gilgamesh, there is Ramses II, there is Nefertiti, there's Atahualpa, like all together in the past. And all your creations are all together. And so you have to speak in that way that we know tends to survive from the past. An allegorical way, as you say, a metaphorical, a mythological way, symbolic way, or I would say, just to summarize, a prophetic way. So a way that speaks across worlds.
I think my only, and I know we're running out of time, but maybe then I end on this, which is going to be a slight critique to that proposal, which makes me think of our world as a self-contained, the way you're presenting it, as if it was a self-contained system that was going to have some sort of like non-liquid or a frozen ending, and then somehow it needs these ruins because there won't be any communication between the next world and the one we're currently in. And we would need to consider how those would be interpreted with a different system or code. And I guess I'm more interested, coming back to the idea of home as this thing that is maybe a bit more tentacular, rhizomatic, and maybe the allegory is not this story simmering into the separate next one in a linear manner, but the one that my body is currently in, being able to access other ones that are still existing within it or without it or in parallel. So I think there's a lot of potential still to create those connections without having to doom what we're in at the moment. There's something quite, catastrophical in the word of the ruin. I like it, it's provocative, but there's also somehow an imminent ending when we speak through that word.
No, I mean, I think it's a very fair point, and I agree with the criticism actually, and I think it's very well pointed, because I think sometimes I might give or maybe in the text, or even I might have given the impression of being quite it's kind of like definitive in the cut between this world and the next world in a very definitive way, and also with a sense of doom about the present. And I agree with you that, of course, like the passages are much smoother from one age to the other. They are smoother, and yet they are noticeable. There is an element of paradox. Of course, you think of the paradox of the heap. One stone is not a heap, 2 stones are not a heap, 10 stones are not, 25,000 stones are a heap. So at some point it becomes a heap of stones. You can't quite locate exactly where. So there is a threshold, however. And so it is in view of that threshold, which is maybe more than the separation, that I think is useful to think of the fact that we are behind the threshold rather than beyond the threshold, and we can communicate. So it's more of a working hypothesis. And about the present, of course, like I think we have like different perspectives on the thing, of course, and so different sensitivities and different ways of dealing with it. But I can relate personally to the tentacular, as you were describing it, approach to the present and the many stories that already exist. And in particular about one way of, and I would like to know actually I would like to end on this asking you, like what, if this is part of something that you do, also interestingly, because you're in Latvia, while not being in Latvia, how do you relate with another?
Lithuania.
sorry, Lithuania. Lithuania, while not being Lithuanian, how do you relate with other places to your place? And that's the way of syncretism, for example. And I agree with you that it is already possible here and now to try to create a tentacular approach. That's one way of looking at it, or a syncretic approach, so a mashing of things together until it's no longer possible to say this or that, mine or yours, Italian or Lithuanian, okay? And that syncretic particular way is, what is fascinating is that it's usually what remains of the past. I mean, in fact, when thinking about the type of ruin to leave behind, I suggest that fundamentally the kind of ruin that will really remain has a syncretic quality to it. It keeps together a number of things that in theory don't belong to each other, not even now, put together somehow and misinterpreted by those who will come after, will put together other bits. Then it starts to really become functional. The syncretic quality. And I would like to know also in your case, if like syncretism is something that you work on.
Absolutely. And now I agree with this notion a bit more. Being able to incorporate, like, I think it's very productive, or not productive, but like interesting to this notion where another ruin is incorporated into our ruin and maybe is misinterpreted, because I feel like a lot of my practice is picking up a story that maybe doesn't belong to my time period and reinterpreting it, maybe misinterpreting it, but allowing myself to tell the narrative that I'm more particularly interested in, and also creating these associations through different scales, times, and territories, not in order to do it not in a playful or gamified manner, but and maybe in a therapeutical one, to borrow from your camaraderie term, which I didn't know. So yeah, and also perhaps to, as an artist, I'm often asked, how can I allow myself to take case studies that are outside of the space that I'm technically belonging to? And I think I'm interested in doing that because it's a way of fragmenting that notion of belonging, or of a stagnant notion of identity. Sometimes I might fail, sometimes it might be problematic, but yeah, I do it.
So yeah, thank you very much. If there are any last comments from Federico, you are welcome. And if not, I'd like to thank you both very much. And I think it's very symbolic and I guess therapeutic that we're ending along the idea of misinterpretation. I think that it gives us a bit of an access into those different registers that often are being gatekept or being imposed by the reality systems that we are living. So Monica's work, her usage of different time frames and discarded objects coming from different periods and being in Lithuania is a very symbolic act, and also the exhibition space as well. So thank you so much for this inspiring conversation. I'm very happy with the results. And the opening of Monica's exhibition is tomorrow at 6 p.m. in Vilnius. For those who are not in Vilnius, we will have a documentation and you'll be able to see it at least digitally. So again, thank you very much, and see you hopefully in Vilnius.